the title of the article is Polite Impoliteness, How Power, Gender, and Language Background Shape Request Strategies in English as a Business Lingua Franca. As we know, it's called BELF, in corporate email exchanges. Okay, and this is this paper was published as a result of a collaboration between myself and Julia Hofweber. So I will just sort of talk you through this presentation, okay, even though I don't know to which extent you've all read it. So it's better to state the obvious, I suppose, okay? So the rationale was really to look at emails, because emails are a key tool of business communication. You know, many times in business communication, even if you sit in the same office, if it's a very big office, and you've got like 200 people on the same floor, like the office I used to work in, sometimes you just end up emailing each other, even if you're in the same office. Okay, so email in business context is just ubiquitous. Okay, and this is why it's important that we increase our understanding of how BELF communication in email specifically works. Another special thing about emails, and why we decided to focus on the email, was because email, in terms of the discursive characteristics, is a sort of hybrid medium, bridging the gap between spoken and written language. Okay, so BELF or ELF research is mostly interested, or is sort of interested in phenomena that emerge naturalistically in natural conversation, in spontaneous conversations, and that happens more often in somewhat informal contexts. Okay, and in a context where there's a level of immediacy and feedback and turn-taking and interaction. Okay, so now, whilst it's of course very hard to kind of record business meetings and get access to it, in this case we had access to the emails, and the advantage is that there we have some level of informality, sort of that level of spontaneity, of turn-taking and interactiveness that is reminiscent of real-time speech and conversations. Okay, so we were hoping that it would be possible to observe naturalistic negotiations in that context, better than, let's say, in a business letter. Okay, so business English as a lingua franca, BELF, I think we all know in this group why we're interested in this. Pretty much every domain, not just even the corporate domain, but also academia, is internationally increasingly using English. So, I mean, I've told you earlier on, I go to lots of conferences on multilingualism and bilingualism, and at these conferences, we spend all day praising multilingualism, but everything is in English at the conference, right? And this is the same in the corporate world. I also remember anecdotally, when I had interactions with clients in Germany, I worked in a London office, there was always this thing that I had to code switch a lot, because a lot of the technical terms, even when you speak in a language other than English, let's say German or Italian or any language, the technical terms in the corporate world are very often English. So then you end up code switching all the time into English. So many businesses just have opted for having English as the base language altogether. And this is particularly the case in international financial hubs like Frankfurt, Zurich, places like that where you get a lot of expats. The office language will often be English, despite of perhaps the national language or regional language being a different language. So BELF has this sort of growing importance, and I'm sure everybody in this forum is aware of that. So this is why we wanted, or why I was interested in looking at it. So there's a wealth of research on emails in general, but so far there's very little about emails in the corporate context. And Lucas has already hinted at that. That's partly due to the fact that it's very hard to access this data because of confidentiality. Okay. So because of that, there's few studies on the ways in which BELF users negotiate relationships to accomplish business goals in authentic emails. Much of the data that's available, not in all studies, but in many studies, is sort of elicited somewhat artificially. So in this study, we were sort of privileged in terms of having exclusive access to completely unedited, authentic business emails. And they did turn out to be very rich in negotiations. So really what we wanted to look at was how BELF users employ their L2 to accomplish transactional goals and maintain interpersonal relationships. So the politeness aspect of the exchanges, what kind of discourse strategies and other resources they use to do so, and then how the usage may be modulated by factors that go beyond just the BELF nature of the communication or the language status, first or second language. And we did a bit of a literature review, and two things that stood out were especially hierarchical relationships in organizations, and then we also looked at gender. So our focus was this relationship aspect, and in terms of the discursive sort of strategies, or in terms of the communicative phenomenon that we looked at politeness. So therefore, we used to theorize, we sort of used one of the most widespread sort of paradigms in politeness research, and that's this notion of the face-threatening act. Okay, face-threatening act means that you utter or you commit a communicative act that could in some way impede or threaten the interlocutor's face. Yeah. So, and requests are speech acts, and we focus specifically on requests because we sort of thought, well, requests are really the quintessential face-threatening act, yeah, because when you make a request, this is a speech act in which the message sender really wants to get the message recipient to do something. So you're really impeding on their face, okay? So you want to either get them to do something, or you're impeding upon their face in the sense that they have to reject your requests, okay? So why is our request quintessentially face-threatening? Well, the semantic content bears great potential for interfering with the recipient's negative face, okay? Being their need to protect their public self-image. So now requests in business negotiations are, of course, especially problematic because really you want to, it's crucial for your negotiation to maintain a good relationship. So on the one hand, you have this need for fatigue union, for kind of a positive, polite relationship that leads to a desirable transactional outcome. But to achieve the transactional outcome at the same time, you need to utter the request, okay? So your choice of strategy to downtone the request or to manage it is crucial, okay? So our research questions were specifically tailored to requests. What kind of request types are predominantly used in business emails in multilingual organizational settings? To what extent is the directness of the requests modulated by BELF users' lingua-cultural background? And with that, I mean both at the macro level, sort of crudely distinguishing between first language users of BELF and second language users, and then also at the micro level, going into the individual L1s and cultural backgrounds, okay? And then thirdly, we looked at these extra linguistic variables such as gender and power. And this is partly because this is the type of information we had available about the email senders and recipients. So that also, the practical reasons also defined our choice of variables that we looked at. So the corpus. So the entirety of the emails that was made available to me by a multinational insurance company comprises 20,000 business emails, okay? They're completely authentic and unedited, and they are all internal email communications, because of course the company couldn't sort of make this available for academic research, any external emails, because they can only decide about their own emails, yeah? So, and mostly they represent negotiations between the head office in London and the local offices in different countries, okay? So really, we have a combination of English L1 and Lingua Franca users. And the Lingua Franca users have a variety of first languages and cultural backgrounds, ranging from Arabic, British, Czech, Dutch, French, German, Hebrew, Hungarian, Irish, Italian, Russian, Spanish. So here you've got an organizational chart which sort of displays or illustrates the relationship between the email senders and the negotiations that were going on, okay? So we have the head office in London in the UK. Head office is very international. There's both English first and second language speakers working in the head office. And then we have the local offices. In the local offices, we have mostly English L2 users, okay? So it's a bit less diverse there. And most of the interactions have something to do with the fact that the local offices have to have business that involves premium income that exceeds a certain threshold, needs to be reviewed and signed off and authorized by the head office. Okay, so we have this through the sort of peer review process, this power relationship. Okay, where the head office are the ones who authorize, so they are high in power, both in terms of organizational structure and in terms of the transactional goals, and the local offices are lower in power. Okay, so we have usually the request coming from the local office to the head office. Can I underwrite this business? Yes or no? And the head office comes back with other types of requests, such as, oh, can you provide more information about the client? You can underwrite the business or transact the business, but you need to add certain clauses to the contract and so on. Okay, so this is sort of the nature of transactions that we have in these emails. Okay, now in this pilot study, the pilot, I call it pilot study really because I'd love to do more with this corpus, you know, but due to restrictions in terms of really labor and also the format of the emails being in Microsoft Office format, sorry, in Outlook format, so you have to copy and paste everything across. So we've so far analyzed a snapshot of 400 emails. So we've merely just scratched the surface really of the corpus. But so we've taken 400 emails and identified request instances, okay? So in terms of our email sender profile characteristics, we had 50% of email senders that are high power and 50% low power. So we made sure we've got a 50-50 split because that was our primary variable of interest. Then 68% were L1 users of English, 32 L2 users. And the gender split between female and male was 42%, 58%. So we used to annotate the corpus, we used and encode and then extract the information, we used XML and Notepad. And then the classification, so looking now at how we classified, okay, so what did we code the data for? So we classified request strategies into direct and indirect strategies, and then we had several other criteria, which I will talk about now in more detail. So to classify the requests into direct and indirect, we used Bloom-Kalker's paradigm, which I'm sure if you've done any research on pragmatics, you are familiar with. Where direct request strategies differ from indirect strategies in that they have greater imposition and they use less mitigation strategies to downtone and mitigate the face-threatening act. Okay, and indirect strategies use more mitigation. Now let's look at the types of direct strategies that Bloom-Kalker described. So the first type are mood deliverables. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. You know what it's like when you always just read something. You know? So mood deliverables, hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly, where the mood of the verb marks the illocutionary force as a request. Okay, so leave me alone. So it's an imperative. Okay, clearly marks the fact that you want to get the person to do something, clean up this mess. Second types are explicit performatives, where the illocutionary force is explicitly stated. I'm asking you, I'm stating what my illocutionary force is to clean up the kitchen. Okay. Then we have hedged performatives, where the statement of the illocutionary force is embedded. I'd like you to give your lecture a week earlier. And finally, we've got one statements, where the expression of the speaker's intentions, desires, and feelings vis-a-vis the fact that the hearer do X. Okay, I really wish you'd clean up the kitchen. So indirect strategies in this paradigm are classified as query preparatories and strong hints. Okay, in query preparatories, the utterance contains reference to preparatory conditions such as the ability or willingness, the possibility of the act being performed, as conventionalized in any specific language. An example would be, could you clean up the kitchen, please? Okay, so you phrase it as a question. Or slightly more indirect, strong hints, okay, where the utterance doesn't directly express the request, but it's a strong hint. Yeah, so you've left the kitchen in a right mess. ... Shouldn't you clean it up? Okay. So when we then sort of tried to make predictions for the power variable, okay, we used as a theoretical framework Scollin and Jones phase system approach. Okay, so this suggests that the hierarchical phase system suggests that employees with asymmetrical power status will use politeness differently. Okay, high power employees will use more positive politeness and direct strategies, and low power employees will use more negative politeness and indirect strategies. So it would predict that the level of directness and the mitigation strategies of the FTA will be affected by power. If the speaker is familiar with the conventions of the speech community or is able to enact the conventions of the specific speech community. So then we also differentiated by request perspective, which can be either hearer-oriented, where the emphasis is on the role of the hearer, such as could you clean up the kitchen, please? Or it could be speaker-oriented, emphasis on the speaker's role as the requester. Can I borrow your notes from yesterday? And then we also have sort of blended scenarios, speaker and hearer orientation. So in terms of the factors affecting strategies, we've already, so looking at previous existing research beyond just the frameworks, in terms of power status, there is Scollin and Jones framework, but there's also existing research that backs this up, you know, that has actually shown that high power employees use more direct strategies than low power employees. Language status, which of course we are interested in because we're looking at BELF communication. So research on language status and proficiency suggests that there's a tendency for non-first language speakers to use more direct strategies than first language speakers. And the way this is often explained in the literature is by making recourse to proficiency, because many of the mitigation strategies to perform or to downtone an FTA are syntactically quite complex. Okay, so the idea being then the rationale explanatory framework in these studies being that they say, okay, well, we see more direct and indirect requests by native speakers and non-native speakers because they're not as proficient. Okay. There's also existing studies that show that gender makes a difference. There's some evidence, there's not that much research, but there's some evidence that men use more direct requests than females. There's also lots of cross-cultural studies. We don't really have time to go into all of them, but I think we go into a bit more detail in the paper if you'd like to read up more about this. And also the medium makes a difference. Emails have been shown to be more direct or encourage directness more than, let's say, formal letters. Now, the crucial thing is that often these variables are investigated separately. And in this study, we really wanted to look at how they interact. Because if you look at just one variable separately, and you find an effect, it may be misleading because you've not really taken into account the complex interaction of all of them. So now moving on to the results. I'm sure you've all read the results in the paper, but I'll just briefly repeat them. So first of all, we found that overall there were more direct than indirect request strategies in the corpus, okay? And the split was 64% direct versus 36% indirect. So there was quite a high degree of imposition and actually limited amount of mitigation of the FTAs. That somewhat surprised us because of the sort of idea that business communication requires a lot of politeness. In fact, what we found in this corpus was quite direct utterances. So then when looking at language status, we didn't actually find an interaction between language status, so whether BELF users are using first or second language, and directness of the request strategy, okay? So in both the first language and second language speaker group, the proportion of direct versus indirect was the same. And this was, yeah, somewhat contrary to existing research, which would suggest that the first language speakers should, in comparison to the second language speakers, use more indirect strategies. So then when we looked at the relationship between language status and power, we found that in the English L1 group, everything was in line with how you would predict things to be based on the hierarchical phase system, okay? So high power employees used more direct strategies than low power employees. And in fact, the low power employees in this case used exclusively indirect strategies. And then when we looked at the English L2 group, however, the pattern was not in line with how it should be predicted by the hierarchical phase system, okay? So the low power employees used more direct strategies than indirect strategies, okay? So this would not be predicted by the hierarchical phase system, which would predict the opposite pattern. And high power employees, we also didn't see the clear preference that the hierarchical phase system would predict. They used direct and indirect strategies equally frequently. So that would then lead you to think, well, it's about language, okay? But when you look at an additional variable, and in this case, we looked at gender, we found that there was a difference between females and males. Females converged with the native speaker, the L1 norms, yeah? So their usage pattern was the same as English L1 speakers, okay? In line with the hierarchical phase system. And it was in the male, so the divergence that we observed in the previous slide was actually due to just the male group diverging from the pattern, okay? So, so in the English L1 group, the English L1 males performed or behaved in terms of request strategies in line with predictions of the hierarchical phase system. High power use more direct and indirect strategies. But in the L2 group, there was this divergence. So the divergence really came from the male English L2 group, in which the high power individuals displayed the opposite pattern to the L1ers, okay? So they used more indirect and direct strategies. And in the low power group, they also performed opposite to what you'd predict based on the hierarchical phase system and what the first language users were doing, okay? So the male L2 group displayed this divergence, okay? And now we also did more detailed analyses by individual language, okay? And we found a significant interaction between linguocultural background and request strategies. And I say lingua cultural because it's very hard to tease apart based on this data set whether this is a cultural or linguistic variable. And anyway, we would predict that at the level of pragmatics, because we're looking at a functional usage here, not at syntax or something else, it's very hard to tease those two variables apart. Okay, so so the majority of BELF users use the same patterns as the overall corpus, as you predict. So 60% roughly direct strategies and 40% indirect. This was the case for English L1ers, German L1ers, Italian, Chinese, and Spanish. But there were 3 cases of linguocultural background in which we found a divergence from the corpus norm. Yeah, so L1 Hebrew speakers used strikingly more direct strategies than the corpus average. Okay, so 97% of their requests were direct. Okay, so less direct were the L1 speakers of French and Dutch. Okay, so French speakers used only 33% of their strategies were direct, and Dutch only 39% in comparison to 60% across the whole corpus. Now, this really suggests that cross-cultural awareness is extremely important in BELF email usage. And anecdotally, I can also say that when I spoke to the people working in that company, they sort of suggested that there was a lot of conflict arose from expectations about directness, lack of it. So in the case of the indirect preference, expectations about how it should be downtoned and mitigated, and in the case of the more direct strategy users, sort of obviously essentially committing a non-sufficiently mitigated FTA when interacting with a particular other culture. So this could be a useful thing when sort of training and teaching BELF users what they should be aware of when interacting with different cultures. So now looking at the qualitative analysis, do please stop me if we run out of time, because I wasn't sure how much time I've got. Well, I'll just carry on until you stop me, okay? So, well, I've got a couple more slides. So now we also looked at the data qualitatively, okay? So let's look at the sort of direct strategies in a bit more detail in a qualitative way. So most of the direct strategies were mood derivables, okay? So we will just be looking at those. 68% of them were of that nature. And in fact, they followed a very formulaic pattern. Pretty much all of them followed this formulaic pattern of please plus verb in the imperative, okay? Please cancel, please advise, please issue, please get in contact, please let me have an answer. So now in the emails that were sent from high to low power employees, there was a great diversity of verbs demanding actions, okay? So the verbs that they were using demanded actions, that they were demanding something from the low power employees. Now, when we looked at the mood derivables in the other direction, when emails were sent from low to high power employees, we found the same formulaic pattern. So formally, they were done, enacted in the same way. The requests were enacted in the same style, formally. But when we looked at the verb semantics, they were quite different, okay? So they were more, let's say, humble, more sort of, there was almost something mitigating and downtoning, not in the form, but in the semantics of the verb, okay? So they tended to be more seeking help and more, let's say, face-saving semantics, right? So you can see here, even though the form is the same, please plus imperative, it sounds very different when the verb is got a different semantic meaning. Please advise, please confirm, please help, and so on. Please update me, so inform me. Okay, so now looking at the indirect requests, almost all of them were query preparatories, okay? So we had 80 instances of query preparatives, 39 emails from high to low power, and 43 low to high power. So, and again, across both power relationships, we had the same formulaic pattern. We had an auxiliary and please, would you, could you please, but the verb semantics differed in a similar way as they did for the mood derivables, okay? So it's pretty much a similar pattern, yeah? So this suggests we shouldn't just use at the form, but also at the meaning of the verbs in this case, for example. So when we look at hearer versus speaker orientation, we found a lot more hearer orientation than speaker orientation, very few instances of combinations. And this means that the corpus had, it sort of again suggests that the corpus had a very high level of directness, okay? Because hearer orientation in your requests, focusing on what you want the hearer to do, has a higher level of imposition. So conclusions, okay, and they're preliminary because obviously this is a forum in which we probably like to discuss, and I'd be very interested in your explanations of these findings. So we found a very high degree of directness and imposition, okay? The FTAs are only softened by the use of politeness markers such as please or kindly used in a formulaic way. It's quite simple as well. Perhaps time pressure plays a role here, yeah? And certain conventions in this particular community of practice, yeah? So business emails reflect the primary goal of business, that is to get things done, and are important tools for accomplishment of this goal. So there's limited fatigue communication simply because of time constraints and this aim to get things done quickly. I remember when I started working in that industry, the address terms, which would be an interesting thing to look at in this corpus as well. Usually it's just name. There's no hi, no dear. And when I first started working there, I was sort of taken aback by that, you know, until I got used to it. And then it was just normal to just say Julia rather than dear or hi, Julia, you know. So quite a high level of directness, okay. We didn't really see an impact of language status on its own. And this is probably due to the fact that here we really use looking at users, not learners, you know, BELF users, not learners, who have very high proficiency in English. But we did observe this complex interaction of language, power, and gender. And I'd be very interested in your thoughts about how to explain that. So overall, the emails did reflect the hierarchical phase system, with the exception of this interaction with gender. So we did sort of see the pattern predicted that high power employees use more direct strategies than low power employees. So power matters, okay? And it's not only interacted through the request types as informally, but also through the choice of semantics, yeah? So limitations and future directions. So we'd like to analyze, of course, more of the corpus. We just need to find the resources to do that. We need more fine-grained annotation, taking into consideration downtoners, address terms, other things. A limitation is that we have a low number of L1 speakers in low power positions. Okay, we have some because there was an Irish local office, but so that's a limitation, okay? The gender split is atypical for this industry in the sense that there's quite a high proportion of females in high power positions, which is very unusual for the insurance, generally the financial sector. So this can be useful. It was useful for our study because we had sufficient numbers of females in high power positions to tease apart power and gender, but it could be an unusual case, right? Because in many corporations, you won't get that many females in high power positions. And it would also be interesting to look at accommodation strategies. So I'd like to thank the Insurance Institute of London, especially the Secretary Alison Potts, who helped with the data access, the anonymous insurance company who made the data available, and Professor Shuhu at Birkbeck College, who played a pivotal role in conceptualizing the project at its early stages.